This is Keep Up. I'm your host, Cynthia Dill. It's Wednesday, November 5th, 2025. I'm in my Cape Elizabeth studio for this election 2025 post-mortem. As many of you may know, we had Laurel Libby on the show recently, Representative Laurel Libby, who also co-founded the Dinner Table PAC that was behind question one on Maine's ballot yesterday around voter ID. And at the time she was a guest of the show, the polling had the yes and no on that question neck and neck, a virtual tie. Well, yesterday, question one went down in flames, 64 to 36, no to yes. So you win some, you lose some. Laurel Libby still, I'm sure, basking in the glow of her victory at the Supreme Court of the United States related to her challenge against the Speaker of the House and the Maine House of Representatives censuring her over her free speech around protecting girls' sports. And that was a big win. Yesterday was a big loss on question one for her on voter ID. But yesterday also launched Protect Girls' Sports in Maine. And that's an effort I don't know if she's involved in necessarily, but I know it's something that I care about. And already, um, we're seeing sort of a manipulation of what's at play here. And so I thought we'd spend a little time today just talking about exactly what the Protect Girls Sports in Maine initiative is all about. I'm up close and personal to it to a certain extent because yesterday I had the pleasure of spending about almost 4 hours in Baldwin, Maine at the town offices. It's a old school that now serves multi-purposes. It's the town hall, it's the community center, it's where the fire department has an office. The kids go trick-or-treating there. There's Salvation Army boxes. I mean, there's a lot going on. It's a great space. You feel very warm there. And I was there collecting signatures for the petition, the Citizens Initiative that is just underway as of yesterday, to put on next year's ballot a question around protecting girls' sports, which really boils down to around recognizing again the biological reality of sex. Because what happened is in 2019, unbeknownst to most of the people in Maine, the law in the state of Maine was changed dramatically. And so this effort underway is to basically reverse that and to get back to just some common sense understanding of what male and female means and what protecting girls and women on the basis of sex means. And it's simply separating athletic teams and private spaces on the basis of sex. That's what the petition is about. But what's interesting, I think, is that and connecting this petition signature gathering effort with the question one on the ballot yesterday is that some of the proponents of voter ID believe quite strongly that the partisan shenanigans of Secretary of State Shanna Bellows is in part responsible for the loss of the issue on voter ID because they say that the secretary, using her bully pulpit and power of the office of the Secretary of State that runs elections, worded the question so heavily against it, voter ID, that it was doomed for failure, and that may be true. I mean, I didn't study the underlying legislation. I think, though, that the proponents of voter ID have learned a very important lesson, and that is you just have to keep it simple. And so, in that campaign, yes on one, the no on one campaign that was managed by David Farmer, who has been around in Maine politics for as long as I can remember. He was, I think, the chief of staff for Governor Baldacci, or maybe he was his press secretary. I know that, and it's been a consultant in just so many elections in Maine. He's a expert, and he ran an expert campaign. And what they did was sort of make it all about absentee voting because people love absentee voting. So even though a majority of Maine people really do want voter ID or at least support it or are not opposed to it, what they also really like is absentee voting. And so the messaging around the campaign was really uh, some would argue misleading, but all's fair in love and politics. And so the no on one really benefited from uh, the wording on the ballot and the owning of the message around absentee voting. So let's now talk about protect girls' sports in Maine, because the getting the petition is also an exercise that has to happen in the Secretary of State's office domain. And so the petition that I was collecting signatures on in Baldwin, Maine, which is about it took me about an hour to get to Baldwin, due west on 25 and then 113. It's around Steep Falls, near Cornish, and it's just off of, if you blink, you miss it. There's about 1,400 voters, lovely people. I loved being there. And they were my people because I didn't have to do too much explaining on this petition to get like an overwhelming number of people signing it. They were lining up and waiting to sign the petition to protect girls' sports. I mean, they want this desperately to happen. So that was kind of fun to have such a positive response. And what's interesting to me is that this petition has a summary that's drafted by the Secretary of State, and including an estimate of fiscal impact that this law will have. That's longer than the statute itself. That's longer than the proposed legislation. And I think what's also interesting is that the Maine Human Rights Commission added on, with the consent of the Secretary of State, an estimated fiscal cost of $410,000, because they say the bureaucracy responsible for gender identity, which I'm going to get to in a minute, the bureaucracy says they're going to have to hire another lawyer and a paralegal to manage all the additional litigation that will ensue if we go back to recognizing the biological reality of women and girls, and protect their spaces and athletic teams on the basis of sex. So just keep that in mind. That's what this petition that people signing to get the question on next year's ballot about separating athletic teams in public schools and bathrooms and locker rooms and private spaces on the basis of sex, um, is it's I think it's somewhat confusing, but that's how simple it is, and we have to get 68,000 signatures, 10% of the last number of voters who participated in the gubernatorial election. So you have basically a campaign like this has to get about 70,000 signatures, I think, by February, to have it on November's ballot next year, November, which is when we'll be electing a new governor, as well as determining if Susan Collins is going to continue as our United States Senator, as the only moderate Republican and the only Republican in the Northeast representing New Englanders down in Washington. So, and the reason, and it's already being framed as anti-trans, even though what it does is simply say that public schools have to have athletic teams on the basis, divided on the basis of biological sex, and it defines sex as the what's recorded, your biological sex as recorded at birth. And then it says also, very, very importantly, that nothing in this, referendum law, that nothing in this citizens initiative, should it become law, would prevent anyone with a disability from being accommodated like everyone else, according with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So we're just getting back to a place where, if in fact you are an individual who has gender dysphoria diagnosis, or otherwise is incapable, or it's very difficult for you to abide by the law, then you can get an accommodation in accordance with, the rules around getting accommodations. There's a balance of what's reasonable, undue hardship, and everybody's rights are protected. So the question is, why do we need this? People think it's about anti-trans. Well, no, it's not anti-trans at all. It's not anti-trans. It's what happened. Let's go back to 2019. Let's just close your mind for a minute and bring yourself back to 2019, and let me set the stage for you. In Democratic politics in Augusta, Matt Moonen, who was the majority leader, was also the executive director of Equality Maine. The Maine Human Rights Commission was lobbied to put forth its commission bill that it called, I think, very unfairly, an act to clarify various provisions of the Maine Human Rights Act, and included in Maine law for the first time gender identity as a protected status. Now, that's not just clarifying provisions of the Maine Human Rights Act. That's a huge change. So what happened in 2019 in basically the cover of darkness is we all of a sudden as a state stopped recognizing biological sex and basically said that sex can change, that, and that's not just a clarification, that's a fundamental altering of women's rights and girls' rights, and we see it playing out. And so gender identity was added to the Maine Human Rights Act in 2019, and guess what? The fiscal note, no fiscal impact. So you can look it up, it was the 129th Maine Legislature, LD 1701. And what's also interesting at the time is Shenna Bellows, who's the Secretary of State, was a senator on the Judiciary Committee, full-throated proponent of this law, and now, of course, is I think making it difficult. It seems by printing up this petition that literally has more words summarizing the law than the actual law itself, and a ridiculous fiscal note. So the suggestion is if we get back to a time when biological sex is recognized in Maine law, there's going to be a lot of litigation. No, I don't think so. I think we have all this litigation because of this mistake in 2019 that was supported by the MCLU, of course, Equality Maine, um, Planned Parenthood, all the liberal organizations that bandy together to move their agenda. I get it, that's how politics works, but this happened very discreetly, and all of a sudden, gender identity now, the concept that you're not divided as humans on the basis of sex, which is the foundation for Title IX and for women's rights. But no, now gender identity is, oh, it's whatever you feel inside. You can essentially change your sex. So that's just a huge, huge, huge repercussion in the law that has made its way in every nook and cranny of our society, of our culture, of our communities, gender identity. So this is why all of a sudden we have this issue of men, in women's shelters, in women's prisons. This is why boys now suddenly are playing on girls' sports teams and entering their locker rooms and their bathrooms. It never happened before because before gender identity was a protected status, the only way that could happen is if you did like Nicole Maines did in the big case here in Maine. If you had a disability, if you had gender dysphoria as a diagnosis, then you had a process by which you sought a reasonable accommodation. What gender identity did in 2019 is totally flipped it on its head. So you don't need a diagnosis. You just say, uh, Monday, I identify as a woman. Tuesday, after I get arrested and I'm I identify as a man. Wednesday, when I get my sentence, I don't want to go to a man's prison. I identify as a woman, so I'm going in a women's prison. The teachers in schools are having to recognize kids who change their identity, who change their name. This all happened in 2019 because of the change in law that was sponsored by the Human Rights Commission, a bureaucracy, a woke bureaucracy, in my view, that pushed this agenda without properly informing the public of the consequences, without properly naming the legislation, by saying there was no cost. So that happens in 2019. So here we are in 2025, and I'm collecting signatures to protect girls' sports in Maine because it's simple. Most people recognize the reality of the biological sexes in all kinds of cases and throughout Maine law. I mean, Maine law recognizes and gives special advantage to female lobsters, to female pheasants, to female dogs, all these things. Ask any farmer about male and female, and people understand this. And of course, there is exceptions. Of course, there are people who are born differently, and there are places in the proposed law to protect those people. Excuse me. So don't be discouraged. Sign the petition.